Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. I moved my room around, so I'm sorry if my angles are off, the lighting's off. I have to use actual lighting because I'm no longer near my window, but I just needed a change, and anytime I need a change or I feel stressed or anything, I decide to move all the furniture around in my room, or I start to declutter and make a mess. I did both yesterday, and so this is what we get. So for this video, I figured I would go through the book of Ezra, and actually this is gonna end up being a two-parter. Since we're going through all the books that I had listed out in my 90-day Bible reading plan, I didn't have, which one was it? Nehemiah? I didn't have Nehemiah on the list, but after reviewing some of the context of this book, and yeah, it's just that Ezra and Nehemiah go together. So I'm gonna do Nehemiah after, so that way we can kind of get some sort of, there are words in my brain, but my brain does not want my mouth to know them. So there can be cohesion within these two recaps, so they're back to back, and it just also will help my mind as I'm learning and reading and studying. I've already so last week I had started filming this, and I did the first day where I went through, learned all the, I went through all my resources. I went through all the purpose, the theme, the content, the context, all that stuff, and I just hated the footage. And it was also a week ago because clearly I didn't pick up my camera again. I didn't continue reading through Ezra. I started reading something else, and I really wanted to get my Jonah stuff out, so I was just working on other things, and I figured I'd come back to this, and I didn't really have the time to sit and do my quiet time while filming it, because it does take longer when I decide to film it. So we're refilming, we're starting over, but I can read to you guys the stuff that I already had for the purpose and themes, but I figured we would chat about the resources and things that I want to use these next few days as we read. And I'm sorry that that was the longest intro ever, the longest. So I did use the video from the Bible Project. I did watch that, so I can leave that link down below. I don't know if I'm going to use any other online resource, maybe Bible Hub. I'll see what they say and just click around there and see. But I am going to be using my my ESV Student Study Bible. I use this all the time when I am studying, reading, everything. And then I also have the Moody Bible Commentary. I've been really enjoying this so far, so we'll go into this a little bit, and we have some information over here to read and to journal. I have my ESV Interleaved Journaling Bible. This one is the big guy, the leather bound, the expensive one. There is a hardcover one available somewhere, but these things I think are typically sold out. I know they have this one because I checked it earlier, but it's pricey. It's pricey. I did splurge. I did save to get this one, but it is pricey. Now that we have that out of the way, let's chat a little bit about the book of Ezra. Where's my phone? One moment. The dog wants to go out. I'll be back. Okay, so when I started looking up the background information, overview information that I do for all of these recaps, I got that the name Ezra is Hebrew for helper. And then the themes in this book are faithfulness to the Lord, both in keeping the Mosaic law and worship. Because of Ezra's concern about worship, he stresses the importance of rebuilding the temple. And from the Moody Commentary, we get that restoration of the covenant identity of Israel through God's providence. And from that, there's 5 points that the Moody Commentary gives us about this restoration of the covenant identity of Israel. And it's one that the narration of the way God fulfilled his promises to restore his covenant people to the land of Judah after the Babylonian captivity, revelation of God's potential care of his children, and illustration of the way imperial powers can be used to further God's redemptive purposes, process of the restoration involved in the rebuilding of the political and religious structures necessary to secure the continuity of Judean conventional identity during the Persian period would be remembered. And then it also details the rebuilding of the temple and the reconstitution of the people of God living in accordance with the law of Moses. And Ezra wrote because he understands the return from captivity as a promise of an even greater return. So those were kind of like the themes, and like from the Moody commentary, like its theme and purpose. From my Life Application Bible, it said that the purpose was to show God's faithfulness and the way he kept his promise to restore his people to their land. My Student Study Bible said that the purpose was to encourage the community toward pure worship and holy behavior. And then my Bible Knowledge commentary had actually said that the purpose was to encourage the remnant to be involved in true temple worship and to remind them to fulfill their covenantal obligations because of God's mercy. Ezra wanted his readers to emulate the same attitude of dependence on God. So I feel like that was a long spiel about the purpose and themes of the book. But for context, this is like from the Bible Knowledge, the Bible Project, and then I was just looking up some stuff, and it says how at some point the books of Ezra and Nehemiah were once together as one. At some point in the Hebrew book, they are still together as one. They both have a similar theme and purpose. Ezra's concern over the worship of the people leads to him stressing over the importance of rebuilding the temple, and Nehemiah laments over rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. It's kind of like a part one, part two of each other within Ezra and Nehemiah, for context and a timeline. This is happening after 2 Kings. After the Babylonians destroyed the Jerusalem temple and took many people captive, this book takes place about 20 years after that. Ezra and Nehemiah can be broken down into 3 parts: the key leaders of the time and their efforts. We're going to look at parts 1 and 2 today throughout this week for this video for the book of Ezra, and then part 3, the third leader, is Nehemiah, so his book. And each of the parts, each leader, the 3 key leaders here, they kind of have parallel stories where the Persian king is moved by God to send the leader back to Jerusalem and offers support and resources. Each leader faces opposition in their efforts, and each story leads to a strange anti-climax. So the first leader we're going to read about is from Ezra 1 through 6, and it's Zerubbabel. And he led a large group of people back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. 60 years later, Ezra, in Ezra 7 through 10, Ezra teaches the Torah and rebuilds the community. And then in the book of Nehemiah, which we're not covering, it's talking about the rebuilding of the Jerusalem walls. Now that I'm looking at this, I'm a little confused because real life right here. Now that I'm saying everything out loud for a second time, if the book of Ezra is stressing the importance, I guess it kind of makes sense. Like I just had a moment. The book of Ezra is focusing on the rebuilding of the temple, and in my mind I was thinking that had to mean Ezra the prophet himself too, but I guess the book itself can still stress it with him not being the like the leader of that portion where the people build the temple. Hopefully that made sense, because it's like my real life brain just like taking in information and taking a moment to connect. That is basically all the background information that I have looked up, researched, seen, read, heard, studied. So I'm not sure I'm going to break up this video, but I will get back to you at another time, and we'll for sure be covering the first part, which is Zerubbabel, for Ezra 1 through 6. I don't think Ezra is a super huge book. It's 10 chapters. It's not too bad. So maybe I will spend the next couple of days doing some reading, and then we can chat then. Hello everyone. It's been a few days now, and I've actually read through the entire book of Ezra, so I figured we would just talk about it all together and go through both parts here. I did not do any Bible journaling notes, but if I get a chance to put my notes in, I will show you guys that after I do my Nehemiah recap too, because I plan on doing it right after this, since both of them seem to go together. I want to keep it all together and just keep on with the flow. So I will try and get notes put into my Bible so you guys can kind of see how I plan on journaling then. So I figured I would just go right into the recap. Just as a reminder, the book of Ezra with Nehemiah is broken down into 3 parts where there are parallel stories, and there's a 4th part of Nehemiah, which we'll touch on next time. Within the 2 stories that we'll see today, for part 1 and part 2 of Ezra, we see how the Persian king is moved by God to send leaders back to Jerusalem, and they offer resources and support. And then we see how each leader faces opposition in their efforts, and then how it kind of leads to a strange anti-climax. And something I will say is, after going through and watching the video from the Bible Project, I don't agree 100% with just how everything that they said, and I believe I put like quotes here and stuff, just for certain things. I believe when we first talked about this, the first part was with the leader, let me see, what was his name? Zerubbabel. And I find that when I was reading Ezra 1 through 6, it wasn't just Zerubbabel and Jeshua. But Zerubbabel means planted in Babylon. These two men represented the generation born in the Babylonian captivity. And as we go into the book of Ezra, in chapter 1, it's fulfilling a promise made by the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah 25. I forgot to write what verses exactly, but in Jeremiah it talks about the captivity. Something that the Bible Project mentions is how some people were not happy about the new temple and the elders, and just like how the opposition is coming from people that want to help. I didn't get that from reading Ezra. It sounded like it was people of the land that didn't want this to happen. Because it says here for the Bible Project, the descendants of the Israelites who were not taken into exile and had been living around Jerusalem for some time come and offer help with the temple rebuilding in Ezra 4. Zerubbabel refuses and says, "You have no part in our temple." This understandably generates conflict, which Zerubbabel eventually overcomes. But we should feel disappointed, which I would disagree with that. So as we get into the book of Ezra, right at the beginning of chapter 1, we see that the king of Persia, Cyrus at the time, how God supernaturally works in his heart. And we're talking about the land of Judah and Benjamin, the southern kingdom. And the king provides men, resources, gold and silver, and things that had been taken from the previous temple, that they, when they were taken into captivity, how they took all the things out of their temple and put it into their own temples and stuff. That was all returned to them. The king allows them to leave. Chapter 2, we see a numbering of all who went with Zerubbabel, almost like a genealogy of all those that were leaving. So it kind of Ezra really gave me it reminded me of the books of Exodus, Numbers, when you're going through listing of all the tribes and the families and numbers and all that stuff. It had that same feel, which it makes a lot of sense because Ezra, who wrote this book, I think, he was a scholar in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. So I think he had a similar writing style, which reflects. So we get a numbering of all who went with Zerubbabel. And then there's also a chunk from verse 59 to 63 of those that could not prove their lineage with the priesthood. It's been a few months in their return from exile. Then arose Jeshua and Zerubbabel, and they lead the people in the feasts and offerings to the Lord. After about a year from the return of exile, as we go into chapter 3, the Levites are appointed to supervise the work of the house of the Lord, and Jeshua and his sons supervise the workmen in the house of the Lord. After the foundation of the temple was built, they praised the Lord. Verse 11 had said, "For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever towards Israel." And I just love that. As we have been reading in the Old Testament, you just hear so much about God's steadfast love, and that's just one of the ways that he is constantly being characterized as. And I really love that because I've never noticed that before until I started actually doing these recaps, and how much they do say that the Lord is either steadfast or his steadfast love. Towards the end of chapter 3, we see that many of the older generation elders that had seen the previous temple, the one that Solomon had commissioned to get built, they wept. There was a mourning there for what was lost, but there was also this celebration and joy for what was being built. And I think sometimes we can be like this too. I was just thinking about just the church in general, how like you have an older generation at the church and you have a younger generation, and just how those two mingle, and culture changes and the world changes, and just life itself is constantly changing, and how there is that division. but how we as God's people, there just needs to be a connection there, and I feel like they were lacking that, even though it does state that, there were as many shouting for joy as there were weeping, that the two could not be distinguished. And I just feel like as God's people, older and younger, we should find a way to intermingle and dwell together in a way that's worshipful and that's God honoring versus just having division. Then as we get into chapter 4, and this is where I disagree with the Bible Project, where they say it was the older generation or other Israelites, because it says, "Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the fathers and said to them, 'Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do. We've been sacrificing to him ever since the days,'" and all this. And I can understand where they're getting that, these people wanted to build with them and they worship the same God. But the Bible calls them adversaries. And someone who's an adversary is one's opponent in a contest, conflict, or dispute. So I don't think that their intentions were good to begin with. Zerubbabel denies their help. In the Bible Project, they claim that these are also Israelites, but they never themselves claim to be Israelites. They just claim to have the same God. As we keep going into chapter 4, we can see that the people of the land are discouraging the people of Judah and made them afraid to build for the rest of the days of King Cyrus, which is important because King Cyrus is the one that made the decree to let the Israelites leave and rebuild their temple. And then also a letter of accusation was written against Judah and Jerusalem to the king, this new king. And basically the letter outlines how they are rebellious and a wicked city. The people will not pay their dues. Their book of records holds proof that the city will be hurtful to the kings and the providences. And if the city and walls rebuilt, there would be no possession beyond the river. This king's response, I forgot what was his name? King Artaxerxes. He makes a decree for building to cease, and this was done by force and power. So the book of Ezra also mentions the prophets Haggai and Zechariah and how they prophesied to the people of Judah and Jerusalem. And Zerubbabel and Jeshua, after this, decide to lead the people to continue rebuilding. A government official questions who gave them decree to start rebuilding and wants to know the name of them who are building. And he now is going to go to the king, King Darius, because now there's another king. So it's taken them time to actually build and get through things. And in his letter, Tenai, I'm assuming his name is the government official, I don't know how to pronounce that. He outlines in his letter his questioning to the people and how the people had told him that they were in captivity, but Cyrus had given them a decree to rebuild. So in chapter 6, we see that King Darius finds this previous decree from Cyrus, and he tells Tatenai, he says, "Let them rebuild. The rebuilding is to be paid from the royal treasury. Anything that they need is to be given without fail." And he also put in verse 11, "Also I make a decree that if anyone alters this edict, a beam shall be pulled out of his house and shall be impaled on it, and his house shall be made a dunghill. May the God who has caused his name to dwell there overthrow any king or people who shall put out a hand to alter this, or to destroy his house, or to destroy this house of God that is in Jerusalem. I, Darius, make a decree. Let it be done with all diligence." Which I think it's amazing that even this king, you can tell, is moved by what the previous king had been moved, how God is softening their hearts to allow his work to be done. And he even makes a decree that, anyone who tries to alter this or take back this word, that, there will be consequences. And I just thought that was amazing. At the end of chapter 6, so the end of this first part, we see that the rebuilding takes place and was completed in the prophesying of Haggai and Zechariah, and they were celebrating the dedication of the house of God, and they also celebrated the Passover. And that is part 1. And as we go into part 2, we see the leader, Ezra emerge. And Ezra is a direct descendant of Aaron. As we go into chapter 7 through 10, that is when we're going to see Ezra. It starts off with that. In chapter 7, it mentions that Ezra was a scribe and skilled in the knowledge of the Torah, and the king gave him all he asked, for the hand of the Lord his God was upon him. And they say this a lot, how the hand of the Lord of God is upon him or his people, or they always mention Ezra either with how God's hand is upon him or how he was skilled in his knowledge of the Torah, which I think is an amazing characteristic that obviously if he's the writer of this book, of course he's going to pat himself on the back on his skill and knowledge. But God's word is it's God's word, so nothing's written that God did not allow either. But there's that. And then as we keep going into chapter 7, it says, for Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to do it and to teach his statutes and rules in Israel. Ezra had a desire for God's heart for his people. He had a desire to learn God's word and to share it with the people so they would know. And you see this especially once the people sin, how he reacts. As we get towards the end of chapter 7, we see once again how the people of Israel are allowed to leave and they're given the resources to properly serve and honor and offer to God. How just like with the first part, the Israelites are sent off by King Cyrus with resources and told to go. Same thing is happening with Ezra. The king also grants the temple workers exemptions from taxes and tolls. The king also allows Ezra to appoint magistrates and judges over his people that know the law, and also allows Ezra to teach his people that don't know it. The king also gave a warning. Whoever will not obey the law of your God and the law of the king, let judgment be strictly executed on him, whether for death or for banishment, for the confiscation of his goods, or for imprisonment. So there was also warning too. And then we see the closing of chapter 7 with Ezra thanking God for his blessings and allowing the king to do all this for them. As we go into chapter 8, we see the genealogy of those that left with Ezra. But among them were no men from the tribe of Levi, so Ezra sends for men from another city, and we see what men come. As they are heading down, Ezra proclaims a fast, firstly so they could humble themselves before God, and secondly so they could seek a safe journey. Ezra hadn't asked the king for soldiers for the journey because he had told him that the hand of the Lord was upon them. So it was a testament of God's protection for his people. As they travel too, Ezra separates the silver, gold, all the things that they need for offerings and for the temple. He separates them among the different men as they travel. God does keep them safe, and once they arrive, they count all the money and everything is accounted for. And they also delivered the king's commission to the king's officials and made offerings before the Lord. As we get into chapter 9, we see how the officials tell Ezra that the people have not separated themselves from the people of the land, and they have also intermarried with them, which is breaking the commandment of Deuteronomy 23. It says, verse 2, no one born of a forbidden union may enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord. No Ammonite, no Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and with water. Just talking about intermarrying with others. They were supposed to marry within the tribes of Israel. So we see Ezra tear his clothes and pull at his hair. He was grieved for the people's lack of obedience to the law, and so he fasted before the Lord. And then Ezra prays to God. He acknowledges that they have sinned before God and that they are guilty and full of shame. Because of this, he kind of retells to God what has happened, how because of their sin, God gave them over to their enemies, and how they were slaves, but God did not forsake them, how God's steadfast love has given them favor before the king, and how they were able to rebuild his temple. But then he also mentions how they have sinned again, the intermarrying and all that stuff. The breaking of God's commandment, and for how much they have sinned. Ezra states that God has not punished them enough, and he proclaims their guilt again before God. And then as we go into chapter 10, we see that the people gather around Ezra and they kind of acknowledge their sin, but they want a way out instead of, bearing the consequence, or even just understanding that that they've made this commitment, they must stick to it. They want Ezra to find a way for them to get out of this. They ask him to make a covenant for them to put away these foreign wives, so that way they can. They were asking for a covenant of divorce, and they pressured Ezra into doing this. Ezra leaves again to fast, and this proclamation is made. The men were to assemble at Jerusalem within 3 days, or forfeit all their possessions and be banned from the congregation. And as the men assemble, Ezra makes a proclamation that they have sinned before the Lord, and that they are to separate from these foreign people. The men ask for more time and another date, and Ezra appoints the men and all that stuff. The Bible Project says that this was not done completely. In verse 17, it says, "And by the first day of the first month, they had come to the end of all the men who had married foreign women." So to me, that sounds like they all came forward. And then at the end of chapter 10, we get a list of all the men who had married foreign women and put them away. And some of these women also had had children. Something to point out is that God never specifically told Ezra to make this proclamation. It just didn't make sense. Well, one, God holds marriage to such a high value that it just doesn't make sense to me. And the Bible Project had this to say. It said, "The story is strange for a number of reasons. God never commanded Ezra to do any of this. It was the leaders of Jerusalem who compelled Ezra to make this decree. While the contemporary prophet Malachi did say that the exiles should care about purity, he went on to say that God was opposed to divorce." Malachi 2:13-16. The mixed results of this decree fit well in the pattern of this strange, disappointing ending. So we kind of see how it just did not make sense. It was just like a strange build-up to a story. And that's really what the book of Ezra was, because as we'll go into Nehemiah in our next video, hopefully things will start making sense, but we just kind of see how it just kind of ends. Like, it ends with the list of those who had married, and that's it. That is the book of Ezra. It's one of those books where you read it and you're like, I should probably read that again. So that was the book of Ezra. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was, I think, shorter than most of my recaps, but the book itself is a shorter book, and I feel like it's easy to follow. But something I have noticed is that just reading through these Old Testament books, these smaller prophets, I'm kind of understanding just kind of the timeline of Israel, and just understanding previous books that I've read before. Just a lot of things you don't understand when you first read the Bible or first read some of these Old Testament books, and now I'm like, oh, now I understand. This is what happened when these split or whatever. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys in my next one.